You know the moment. You're in the room, the interviewer leans forward, and they say, "Tell me about a time you managed a difficult stakeholder." And your mind goes blank. You've handled 100 difficult stakeholders in your career, but right now you can't find a single one. And the silence is stretching, and you can feel the job slipping. That's what this is for. I've spent more than 20 years delivering projects in the digital, data, and technology space, and I'm going to give you the 10 questions about difficult stakeholders that come up most. And answer every one of them out loud, exactly the way I'd answer it sitting across the table from you. Situation, challenge, task, action, result, and a short reflection at the end. No theory, just the answers, delivered live, so you can hear the shape, the pacing, the tone, and make it your own. Listen to how each one is built, then go and tell your version. Here's the first, Chapter 1. Tell me about a time you managed a stakeholder who was resistant to your project. Thank you very much for the question. In a previous role, the situation was a data platform program where we were replacing an aging reporting system that several teams relied on. And within the first week I realized one of my most senior stakeholders didn't want it to happen at all. Not had concerns. Didn't want it. He'd commissioned the old system years before, and much of his reputation was built on it. To him, replacing it wasn't progress. It was a verdict on his judgment. The challenge was that he held real power. He sat on the board that signed off our funding, and he'd made it quietly clear to his team that cooperation was optional. The colleagues he sent came to requirements meetings but couldn't make decisions. Data we needed took weeks to arrive. Nothing was ever refused outright, which would have been easier to escalate. It was just slow, and vague, and heavy. My task was to keep the program moving without turning it into a war I couldn't win. Going over his head early would have made an enemy for the entire delivery. And I needed him for years, not weeks. So my approach was this. I stopped treating him as an obstacle and started treating him as a source of expertise. I asked him for a one-to-one, no agenda, no slides, and I told him honestly that nobody understood the old system better than he did, and I wanted to learn from him. And I meant it. I asked what it did well, what others got wrong about it, what he was proud of. For the first time he wasn't being managed, he was being consulted. Then I asked him to help me make sure the new platform didn't lose the things that genuinely mattered, and I gave him a named role, Design Assurance, with his name on it in the governance pack. Not a token. A real seat where his experience counted. The shift wasn't instant, but it was real. Within about 6 weeks, his team started turning up to workshops with colleagues who could actually decide things. The data started arriving, and when a tricky question came up at board about whether the new system would handle a particular regulatory report, he answered it for me. Because by then he understood it as well as I did, and he'd helped shape it. The result was that we delivered the platform a quarter later than the original wishlist date, but on the realistic baseline we'd reset together. And the team that had been the biggest blocker became one of the heaviest users within 3 months of go live. Adoption there was the highest across the organization, and looking back, what it taught me is that resistance is almost always about loss, not logic. People don't dig in because they're stupid. They dig in because they're protecting something. Status, pride, a sense that their past work mattered. Once I found the loss, honored it, and gave him a way to stay important in the new world we were building, the resistance turned into my strongest support. That covers the stakeholder who quietly resists. The next question is about the one who isn't quiet at all. Chapter 2. Describe a situation where you dealt with an aggressive or hostile stakeholder. Thank you very much for the question. The situation was a customer technology project where my sponsor, a commercial director, ran every steering meeting like a cross-examination. We were replacing the tools a sales team used day to day, and he'd been made accountable for the benefits but given none of the delivery levers. He was anxious, though he'd never have used that word, and those who feel exposed often respond by going on the attack. The challenge was that his style was poisoning the project. In one steering meeting, he interrupted a junior analyst mid-sentence, dismissed her figures as amateurish in front of everyone, and the room went silent. After that, 2 of my strongest team members stopped volunteering anything. And that's the real damage with a stakeholder like this. It isn't just the bad atmosphere. People stop telling you bad news early, and bad news you hear late is what derails a project. My task was twofold: protect my team, and reset the relationship with him, without losing the project, the sponsorship it genuinely needed. What I did first mattered. After that meeting, I spoke to the analyst privately and told her plainly that the way she'd been spoken to wasn't acceptable, and wasn't a reflection of her work. Then I asked the director for a coffee, in person, off the record. I didn't open with a complaint. I opened with the thing he cared about most, the benefits he was on the hook for. I said, "You're accountable for numbers you can't currently see clearly, and that's an unfair position to put anyone in. Let me fix that." His whole posture changed. Nobody had acknowledged the bind he was in. Then I set a boundary, gently but clearly. I told him I'd give him total visibility, a weekly view of the benefit measures, and direct access to me whenever he wanted it. In return, I asked that challenge in the steering meetings come to the numbers and the decisions, not the individuals, because I needed my team confident enough to surface problems while they were still small. I framed it as protecting his interests, not mine. A team that hides bad news from a hostile sponsor is a team that delivers him unwelcome surprises later. The result was that the steering meetings calmed down within a month. He didn't become warm, that wasn't who he was, but he became professional. And the analyst he'd criticized so publicly ended up presenting the benefits case at the closing board with him backing her. The project landed its core benefits within the first 2 quarters after go live. What I took from it is that aggression is nearly always fear wearing armor. The instinct is to meet force with force or to shrink away, and both make it worse. What worked was naming the fear underneath without ever calling it fear, solving the thing that was actually scaring him, and then, from that position of having helped, setting a calm boundary about behavior. You earn the right to set the boundary by solving the problem first. So that's one hostile voice. The next question is harder, because it's 2 senior stakeholders who both expect you to take their side. Chapter 3. Tell me about a time you handled conflicting priorities between 2 key stakeholders. Thank you very much for the question. The situation was a program that touched 2 divisions at once. A shared technology build that both an operations director and a finance director needed, but for completely different reasons. Operations wanted it fast and feature-rich to fix a service problem that was hurting customers. Finance wanted it lean and cheap, because the budget year was tight, and every pound was being counted. The challenge was that they'd stopped talking to each other directly and started using me as the messenger, which is the worst possible position. Each would tell me their requirement, expect me to deliver it, and treat any compromise as me failing them. I was carrying 2 contradictory mandates and absorbing the friction between 2 leaders who both outranked me. My task was to get a single agreed set of priorities that both could live with, without becoming the human shock absorber for a conflict that wasn't really mine to own. So I refused, politely, to keep being the messenger. I stopped relaying between them. Instead, I built one thing, a single prioritized list of every feature, each tagged with 2 pieces of information, the customer impact and the cost. No opinions, just evidence. Then I did the move that changed everything. I got them both in one room, with that list on the screen, and I didn't present my recommendation. I asked them to make the trade-offs together, in front of each other, with me facilitating. The moment finance could see exactly which customer problem a cut feature would leave unsolved, and operations could see exactly what each extra feature cost, the conversation changed. It stopped being about winning and started being about choosing. I'd prepared the ground carefully. Before that meeting, I met each of them alone, showed them the list, and let them say the unreasonable things privately, so they didn't have to perform them in the room. By the time we were all together, the heat was already out of it. They agreed a phased approach in about 40 minutes. The urgent customer fixes went first within the existing budget, and the nice-to-have features moved into a second phase pending the next year's funding. The result was a delivery plan both of them had built with their own hands, which meant neither could disown it later. The first phase shipped on time and resolved the service problem that had been generating complaints. And the two directors, who'd barely spoken, started copying each other into decisions directly, cutting me out of the messenger role entirely, which was exactly what I wanted. What it taught me is that when two stakeholders conflict, your job isn't to choose between them, and it isn't to carry messages between them. It's to build the shared picture that lets them choose together. People argue endlessly about opinions. They settle quickly when they can both see the same evidence. I wasn't the judge. I was the person who turned the lights on. That's open conflict. The next one is sneakier, the stakeholder who agrees to everything, and then does nothing. Chapter 4. Give me an example of managing a stakeholder who agreed in meetings but failed to follow through. Thank you very much for the question. In another role, the situation was a regulatory change project where I needed a particular team lead's sign-off and resources at several points. In every meeting he was perfect. Agreed the timelines, nodded at the asks, said leave it with me. And then, nothing would move. The documents wouldn't come. The staff he promised wouldn't be freed up. And the next meeting he'd apologize warmly and recommit, just as convincingly. The challenge was that his cheerful unreliability was almost impossible to escalate. If I'd gone to the steering board and said he keeps agreeing and not delivering, it would have sounded petty, and he'd have charmed his way out of it in a sentence. Meanwhile, his slippage was quietly eating my float, and we were heading for a hard regulatory deadline that genuinely could not move. My task was to convert his agreement into actual delivery, and to make any failure to deliver visible and undeniable, without turning it into a personal attack that I'd lose. So I changed how commitments were recorded and seen. I stopped accepting a verbal leave it with me as a commitment. After each meeting I sent a short note, not an essay, listing each thing he'd agreed, the date, and a single named owner, him, on each line. Polite, factual, copied only to him at first. Then I introduced a simple visible tracker into the steering pack. A plain list of actions with a color against each. Green for done, amber for at risk, red for late. Not editorialized, just the truth, shown the same way every time. The first time his actions showed up red on a slide the whole board could see, the dynamic shifted instantly. Nobody had to accuse him of anything. The color did the work. He delivered the next set of actions early, but I also did something quieter alongside it. I asked him privately whether the asks were actually deliberately with the team he had, because I'd started to suspect he was saying yes, because he found it hard to say no. That turned out to be exactly right. He was overcommitted across 5 projects and couldn't admit it. So we renegotiated what he could realistically do, and once his commitments were honest, he kept them. The result was that we hit the regulatory deadline with a fortnight to spare. And the relationship was better, not worse. Because I'd given him a way to be honest about his capacity, instead of forcing him to keep performing a confidence he didn't feel. What I learned is that some stakeholders don't follow through because they're blockers, and others, like him, don't follow through because they can't say no. A yes they can't deliver is simply a no in disguise. Either way, the cure is the same. Make commitments specific, written, and visible, because sunlight does most of the work. But pair that with a private, generous conversation about what's really achievable, because sometimes the unreliability isn't malice. It's someone quietly overstretched and hoping you won't notice. Now here's one that tests your nerve, because this time the difficult stakeholder is the most powerful person in the room. Your own sponsor. Chapter 5. Describe a time you had to manage upwards and challenge a senior stakeholder's decision. Thank you very much for the question. The situation was a transformation program where my sponsor, a director several levels above me, became fixated on a launch date. A specific date, tied to a commitment he'd made publicly within the business. The trouble was that the evidence in front of us, the testing results, the defect rates, the state of the data migration, all said clearly that launching on that date would put live a system that wasn't ready. And those it would hurt were the very users who depended on the service. The challenge was personal. He owned my project, he influenced my career, and he'd publicly nailed his colors to that date. Telling him it was wrong risked the relationship and risked being seen as the negative one, the blocker, the project manager who couldn't make it happen. My task was to change his mind without humiliating him, and to do it with enough rigor that the decision was genuinely his, not a climb down forced by me. So I avoided the trap of opinion versus opinion, because in that contest, rank wins and I'd lose. Instead, I built the case in his language, which was risk. I prepared a short, honest assessment of what could go wrong if we launched on the fixed date, expressed not as my worry but as specific, evidence scenarios with likelihoods and consequences. The data migration error rate. The number of users who could be affected. The realistic cost of a failed launch versus a delayed one. And I didn't just bring the problem. I brought 3 options, each with its own date, risk profile and trade-off, so he had a choice to make rather than a defeat to accept. Then, I did the part that mattered most. I gave him the decision in private first, before any wider meeting, so he never had to change his mind in public. I walked him through the evidence and the options, and I said plainly, "This is your call, and whatever you choose, I'll deliver. But I'd be failing you if I let you make it without seeing this." That sentence is the whole thing. It positions you as loyal, not obstructive. The result was that he chose a delay of 6 weeks, repackaged it himself to his own bosses as a quality decision, which it genuinely was, and came out of it looking responsible rather than late. The system launched stable. The defect rate at go live was a fraction of what it would have been. And he trusted me more afterwards, not less, because I protected him from a mistake while letting him own the call. What it taught me is that managing upwards isn't about being brave enough to say no to power. It's about giving senior leaders what they actually need, which is good information, and a way to change course without losing face. Never make a senior stakeholder choose between being right and being safe. Bring evidence, not opinion. Bring options, not problems. Deliver the hard message in private. And always let the decision be theirs. That's the powerful stakeholder who engages with you. The next question is about the one who won't engage at all. Chapter 6. Tell me about a time you dealt with an unresponsive or disengaged stakeholder. Thank you very much for the question. The situation was a program where a key approver, a head of service whose sign-off we needed at 3 separate gates, simply would not engage. He was overloaded, running a large operational team through a busy period, and our project, important to us, was somewhere near the bottom of his very long list. Emails went unanswered for weeks. Meetings were accepted and then declined an hour before. We were stuck. The challenge was that without his approvals we physically could not proceed past certain points, and each delay compounded the last. But he wasn't being difficult on purpose. He was genuinely buried, and the usual escalation, going to his boss, would have made him resent the project at exactly the moment I needed his goodwill. My task was to get the engagement and decisions I needed in a way that cost him almost nothing, because the truth was I was competing for the scarcest resource he had, which was his attention. So I completely changed what I was asking of him. I'd been sending long emails and inviting him to hour-long meetings, treating my project's importance as if it were obvious to him. It wasn't. So I shrank the ask to almost nothing. Instead of "please review this 40-page document and attend a workshop," I sent him a single message with 3 clear decisions, each with my recommendation already filled in, and asked him only to reply yes, no, or let's talk. To each, I made saying yes to me the easiest thing on his desk that day. I also found his actual rhythm. His assistant told me he cleared his inbox early, before the operational day swallowed him, so I started sending the decisions he needed at 7:45 in the morning, short and sharp. And the replies came back by 9, and I gave him a standing offer. A 15-minute slot, same time each week, that he could use or ignore with no guilt, so the access was there whenever he surfaced without another recurring meeting clogging his diary. The result was that the approvals started flowing, the 3 gates that had been stuck cleared within a fortnight. And he later told me, half apologizing, that mine was the only project that made it easy to say yes, which is possibly the best thing a busy stakeholder can say about you. And what I took from it is that when a stakeholder goes quiet, the instinct is to push harder. Longer emails, more meetings, escalation. Usually that's exactly wrong. Disengagement is often not rejection, it's overload, and the answer is to make engaging with you cheaper than ignoring you. Shrink the ask. Pre-fill the thinking. Meet them in their rhythm, not yours. People show up for the person who doesn't waste their attention. Now, sometimes the difficulty isn't one person. Sometimes you inherit a whole room that's been let down before and trusts nothing you say. Chapter 7. Describe how you rebuilt trust with stakeholders after a project had gone badly. Thank you very much for the question. The situation was a recovery. I was brought in to rescue a program that had already missed 2 major milestones under previous management. The stakeholders, a group of senior team leads, had been promised things repeatedly, and burned every time. By the time I arrived, they'd stopped believing anything anyone from the project told them. One of them said to me, in the first session, "Let me guess, you're going to tell us it's all under control now." The challenge was that I had no credibility to spend, because I'd inherited a deficit. Nothing I said carried weight, because the last 3 project managers in my chair had said similar things and been wrong. Trust wasn't low, it was negative. And you cannot deliver a complex program through stakeholders who assume you're lying. My task was to rebuild belief. And I knew I couldn't do it with words, because words were exactly what they'd learned to distrust. So I stopped making promises entirely for the first month. No grand recovery plan, no reassuring presentations. Instead, I made a series of tiny, specific commitments, and kept every single one. I said, by Thursday you'll have a 1-page summary of where the project actually stands, the difficult parts included. And on Thursday, they had it. Honest, including the uncomfortable detail they'd suspected but never been told. The next week I committed to one small fix, a long-standing reporting irritation, and delivered it. Small promise, kept. Small promise, kept. I was rebuilding trust the only way it can be rebuilt, in small denominations, paid in full, on time. I also did something that cost me in the short term but bought everything later. I told them the truth about the timeline, which was worse than they'd been led to believe. That was a difficult meeting, but it was the first time anyone had given them bad news straight, and the honesty started the trust returning. End. They could finally believe the good news because they'd seen me deliver the bad. The result was that within 3 months the tone of those meetings had completely changed. The cynic who challenged me in the first session became one of the program's strongest advocates, because he'd watched me keep small promises and tell hard truths over and over. We delivered the reset program on the re-baselined plan, and the relationship between the project and the business was repaired in a way that outlasted the project itself. What it taught me is that trust isn't rebuilt with vision or charisma, or a brilliant recovery plan. It's rebuilt with kept promises, and the smaller and more boring the promise, the better. Because each one you keep is evidence. When trust is negative, make tiny commitments and honor them relentlessly, and tell the truth, even when it's worse than they hoped. You can't talk your way out of a hole you talked your way into. You have to deliver your way out, one small kept word at a time. There's a moment inside that work that deserves its own answer, though. The moment you have to look someone in the eye and tell them something they really don't want to hear. Chapter 8. Give me an example of delivering difficult news to a stakeholder and managing their reaction. Thank you very much for the question. The situation was a delivery under pressure where the budget had been reduced mid-program, and something had to give. The analysis pointed clearly at a particular module, one that a senior manager had personally lobbied for and described to her own team as the main reason the project mattered. Cutting it was the right call for the whole. For her, it was a personal blow. The challenge was that how I delivered this would determine whether she became an ally in a hard decision, or an enemy who'd spend the rest of the program undermining it. Bad news delivered badly doesn't just upset a stakeholder, it turns them into opponents. And she had the influence to cause real damage if she felt ambushed. My task was to deliver a decision she'd hate in a way that preserved the relationship and, ideally, brought her with me, rather than leaving her against me. What I did started before the conversation. I made sure she heard it from me, privately, first, never in a group setting where she'd have to manage her reaction in front of others. Then I did 3 things in the conversation itself. I led with the why before the what, walking her through the budget reality and the analysis so the decision had a logic she could follow. Rather than landing it as a verdict, I owned it plainly. I said, "This is my recommendation, and I'm telling you because you deserve to hear it from me directly." And then I stopped talking and let her react, without rushing to fill the silence or defend myself. She was angry, and I let her be angry. Because a person needs to feel heard before they can move on. Then, I did the part that turned it. I didn't leave her with only a loss. I came with a way for her priority to survive in a different form. A lighter version of the capability she cared about, deliverable within the new constraints. And I asked for her help to shape it. I gave her a path from victim of the decision to co-author of the alternative. The result was that after an understandably frosty day or 2, she came back, engaged with the lighter option, improved it, and ended up presenting it herself. The thing she'd feared losing entirely survived in a leaner form she'd helped design. And she stayed an ally for the rest of the program, which she absolutely would not have done if I'd sent that news in a group email or buried it in a status report. What I learned is that the content of bad news you often can't change, but the experience of receiving it you completely control, and that's what a stakeholder remembers. Tell them first, tell them privately, tell them yourself. Lead with the reasoning before the conclusion. Own the decision rather than hiding behind the project has decided. Let them react without defending. And wherever you can, offer a path forward, so they're not left holding only a loss. So far these have mostly been one person at a time. The next question is what happens when there are dozens of them? all wanting different things. Chapter 9. Tell me about a time you managed a large or diverse group of stakeholders with competing interests. Thank you very much for the question. The situation was a program that affected a dozen different teams plus a couple of external suppliers, each with their own priorities, their own anxieties, and their own definition of what success looked like. Dozens of individuals with a legitimate stake, and no possible way to give each of them the careful, personal attention that the difficult ones need. The challenge was that treating everyone the same would mean the genuinely critical, genuinely difficult stakeholders got the same thin slice of attention as those who barely needed updating, and the loud minority would crowd out the quiet majority. I had finite time and an almost infinite demand for it. My task was to engage a large, diverse group effectively without burning out, and without letting the most vocal few hijack the whole program's direction. So I stopped treating stakeholders as one undifferentiated crowd and got deliberate about who got what. I mapped them, honestly, by two things: how much the project affected them, and how much influence they had over it. That gave me a small group who were both highly affected and highly influential, the ones who needed my real time and personal attention, and a much larger group who needed good, regular, low-effort communication but not hours of my week. I stopped feeling guilty about that difference and started designing for it. For the critical few, I gave the personal treatment, the one-to-ones, the early sight of decisions, the careful handling. For the wider group, I built something that scaled, a clear, honest, regular update that went to everyone. The same facts at the same time, so no one felt kept in the dark. Plus an open forum they could come to if they wanted more. And I created a single representative governance group rather than trying to consult everyone on everything. Each area sent one trusted voice who could speak for their part and carry decisions back, so I was managing a room of 12, rather than trying to coordinate 80. I also watched for the trap of the loud minority. A couple of vocal stakeholders tried to dominate, treating volume as if it were importance. I made sure the quieter, equally affected voices were actively brought in, asked directly for their view, so the program's direction reflected genuine priority rather than just who shouted loudest. The result was that a program which could easily have collapsed into noise and competing demands, stayed coherent. Decisions got made at a sensible pace. The critical stakeholders felt properly looked after, the wider group felt informed and respected. And the representative group became a genuine engine for resolving cross-team friction, rather than escalating it all to me. We delivered across all the affected areas, and the stakeholder feedback at the end was the strongest I'd had on a program that size. What it taught me is that at scale, the mistake is trying to give everyone everything, which gives everyone too little and exhausts you. The skill is deliberate differentiation, being honest about who genuinely needs your scarce personal time, and who needs excellent, efficient, respectful communication instead. Map the room. Spend your richest attention where influence and impact are highest. And never let the loudest voice be mistaken for the most important one. There's one last question, and it's the one that separates those who survive difficult stakeholders from those who genuinely master them. Chapter 10. What's the most difficult stakeholder situation you've faced, and what did it teach you? Thank you very much for the question. I'll be honest with you on this one, because the polished success stories only teach you so much. The situation was a high-profile program with a stakeholder who was, by some distance, the most difficult I've worked with. Senior, brilliant, and utterly convinced that he should have been running the program instead of sponsoring it. He undermined me in subtle ways for months. Side conversations. Quiet doubts, planted in the right ears. Faint praise that did more damage than open criticism. It wasn't loud, it was corrosive. The challenge was that I couldn't solve this one with a clever technique, because the difficulty wasn't a misunderstanding I could clear up or a fear I could soothe. He simply didn't want the project to need me, and for a while, honestly, it got to me. I started second-guessing myself, over-preparing, bracing for every meeting. The hardest stakeholder situations aren't just operationally hard, they get inside your head, and a project manager who's lost their own steadiness can't hold anyone else's. My task, I eventually realized, wasn't only to manage him. It was to manage myself, so that his behavior stopped destabilizing my judgment and my team. So after too long spent trying to win him over, I accepted a hard truth. Not every difficult stakeholder becomes an ally. Some you manage rather than convert. So I stopped pouring energy into being liked by him and focused instead on being undeniable. I made my delivery so transparent, so well evidenced, so visibly sound, that the quiet doubts had nothing to feed on. Every decision documented and rational. Every risk surfaced early. Every commitment met. It's very hard to undermine someone whose work is that openly solid. And I built my own support network deliberately. Other senior stakeholders who saw the delivery clearly, so I wasn't dependent on his approval for my standing. I also did the inner work, and I won't pretend that part was easy. I made my peace with the fact that one influential person would probably never be in my corner, and I stopped letting that one cold relationship outweigh the many good ones. I protected my team from his behavior by absorbing it rather than passing it down, and I made sure my own steadiness in the room didn't depend on his mood. The result was mixed, and I'll be honest about it, because that's more useful than a tidy success story. He never became a supporter, but the program delivered. My reputation came through it stronger precisely because colleagues had watched me stay professional under that pressure. And the relationships that mattered, with the team and the wider stakeholder group, were solid. He stayed difficult to the end. I just stopped letting that determine whether I succeeded. And that's the thing I'd most want to leave you with. The goal isn't to win over every difficult stakeholder, because you can't. And chasing that is its own kind of failure. The goal is to deliver well, treat others with respect, even when they don't return it, protect your team, and keep your own judgment steady when someone is trying to shake it. Sometimes managing a difficult stakeholder is about changing them. Sometimes it's about changing the situation. And sometimes, the hardest and most grown-up version, it's about holding your own line with such quiet consistency that their difficulty simply stops mattering to the outcome. The steadiest person in the room usually wins, not by force, but by being impossible to knock over. So before your interview, do 3 things. First, take each of these 10 questions and write your own version using a real situation from your career, in that same shape. Situation, challenge, task, action, result, reflection. The structure carries you when the nerves hit. Your own true stories make it convincing. Second, for every difficult stakeholder you've ever faced, find the loss or the fear that was driving them, and practice naming it out loud, because once you can see what's underneath the behavior, your answers stop sounding like complaints and start sounding like wisdom. Third, pick the one story where you stayed steady under real pressure, and make that your answer for question 10, because that's the one that shows them not just what you do, but who you are when it's hard. If this helped you walk into that room a little steadier, subscribe for more interview preparation built for project managers who want to get hired.